So first of all, how would you describe the world we are living in right now?
Rapidly changing. Those two words. And perhaps if I can just elaborate a little, when we look at it from a technological standpoint, we see how this is moving at breakneck speed with AI changing so many aspects of our life in more ways than one. But also when we look at on the geopolitical side, we're seeing many changes there as well. And when we look at it on the environmental side, we see our environment is very stressed, all that is happening with the impacts of climate change. And on the information side, the misinformation and disinformation that is causing so many challenges, even discord, I would say. And in all of this, our individual bandwidth seem to be on the strain.
So it is changing rapidly, and there is really so much to cope with and deal with. If you were appointed as the UN Secretary General, what would you do first?
Well, I've outlined what would be some of my priorities, but let me say that the UN was not built for easy times. It came after very difficult times, after World War II, and so it was established to deal with global challenges. And as we look at the three pillars of the UN, whether it is on the peace and security pillar, on the development pillar, or the human rights pillar, there is much more that we can do. And so in setting my priorities, I've situated them along the pillars, looking at how we can work harder to prevent and to end conflicts. The Secretary General looking at the tools at her disposal, and when those tools are not enough, how the Secretary General can work closer with the Security Council, with the conflict parties, with those who have influence on the conflict parties. There are many different actors today in the peace and mediation space, so it will be important to form partnerships as we move forward. And on the development side, as you are well aware, we are not close to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And the term of the Secretary General will see the member states looking at the post-2030 agenda. How we move forward will be important, especially as it relates to matching our aspirations with the means of implementation, and that will include access to financing. And I also believe that while we must put human rights at the center of everything we do in the UN, if we're able to have more peace and security, more development, we will be able to have more dividends in human rights as well.
All candidates are facing the same problems and they have slightly different approaches. I'd like to talk about your approach here. And you have described your approach as pragmatic yet principled. But what happens when pragmatism and the principle point in different directions? What would you do?
Pragmatism and principle do not have to be mutually exclusive. For me, when I speak about pragmatism, I'm speaking about being sensible, being practical, looking for what works. And if by chance you have a situation where pragmatism and principle will diverge, the Secretary General must turn to the UN Charter and to international law. That must be the guide always. The Secretary General will have to weigh whether confrontation with powerful countries would yield the type of result that will bring a solution. And I spoke in my vision statement about discernment, knowing when to use which tools, but also which role to play. And there will be times, of course, when the Secretary General will have to speak on many of these issues. And I believe that when that happens, it must be after careful consideration, because you do not want to remove yourself as well from this solution. You want to be part of the solution. And if confrontation is going to remove you from that and remove the UN, which you are the Secretary General of, from that, you have to think about that seriously. But what I think is important is for the Secretary General to always be that bridge builder, bringing together member states for solutions. This is how I would approach my work. This is how I've always approached my work, whether it was on the Security Council or when I was a minister in my own country.
It is easier said than done. It's not easy always to bring everyone together to the negotiating table. Let's have a look at the Permanent Five, the P5.
The interesting thing that I've learned on the Security Council is that there is always space for the Secretary General. When countries are not able to come together, the Secretary General is that neutral voice and can make proposals. But also, when we were on the Security Council, Ghana was the smallest state in our second year on the Council. And there were times when there were differences in views on particular situations, and we stepped up. We were the ones being the messenger, talking to all sides, because some of these situations really require action by the Security Council. But it's important to understand where others are coming from, why they are holding the positions they hold. And we have had situations where Guyana, and where I personally stepped up to be the one talking to the different parties. And we saw resolutions being passed, which at the beginning we thought might not be possible.
And you spent 2 years representing Guyana at the Security Council. Was there any moments that really convinced you that the UN needs to change? And now?
The Security Council is empowered by the Charter to act. And there were times when I thought that the Security Council could have done more.
Mm-hmm. And how about Gaza and West Bank? And what do you think that you would do if you are appointed as the UN Secretary General to deal with the humanitarian crises?
Well, first of all, what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank, as we know, is linked to the larger situation of moving to a two-state solution. There are many resolutions of the UN, both the General Assembly and the Security Council. And whatever the Secretary General is required to do must be guided by those resolutions. And on the humanitarian situation, it is important that we step up to ensure that people do not die because of the lack of food. We've seen this happening, but there are also other humanitarian needs. It's a very difficult situation, but we have to continue to put all our efforts to ensure that we bring the assistance to the people who need it in Gaza.
I think the question is, what would you do differently?
Well, there's so much that you could learn from where you are as a candidate and from where I sat on the Security Council. What were some of the challenges and what were some of the steps that were taken. But once you were in as Secretary General, you would be able to have much more information to see what else can be done, what else can be done differently. My understanding is that we have had some improvements, let's say compared to 9 months ago or 10 months ago, but the situation is still very dire. So I would want to do an assessment, to talk with all who are working on this, to make sure that whatever we do is to improve the situation and not to make it worse.
I also want to talk about developing countries, the Global South, and what would you do to make sure that their voice can be heard?
The developing countries in the United Nations, it's a very important bloc. As you know, the G77 and China, it's 134 countries. They lead quite a lot of processes. They are very much part of the norm setting in the United Nations. However, the United Nations is not where the decisions on financing, for example, is made. This is made by the international financial institutions. And this is where developing countries have been calling for certain types of reforms that would make the playing field fairer. So access to finance has been a very important aspect of the advocacy of developing countries. And as Secretary General, I would work very closely with the IFIs, using some of the information that we have in the UN to advance these discussions. I do not believe that we have to have an entire huge reform of the IFIs to see progress. So even incremental steps that are systemic, that would, for example, make it easier for developing countries to access finance so that they can work on their development goals would be a priority of mine.
And lastly, what would you hope to achieve at the end of your tenure if you're appointed?
It's a little bit presumptuous to think about legacy and my tenure, but whether it is me as Secretary General or someone else as Secretary General, I would like to see at the end of the next 5 years, 5 things. I would like to see that the reforms that the UN is engaged in right now would have yielded results on the ground in particular. That when you talk to people on the ground, they would say, yes, the UN has improved delivery. We have done quite a lot of good work, but many things have changed, and the UN must also change to adjust to the situation we face today. I would also like to see that some of the conflicts that we have right now have ended, and that also where there were conflicts that were brewing, that we would have prevented them as well. On the development side, I would like to see that we made progress with the IFIs and that the needle has moved in terms of access to finance, but also in terms of private sector investment, that would have improved in countries as well, and that the UN would have been a major partner in providing the assistance to countries to make them ready for that private sector investment. Of course, I would like to see the human rights situation improved as well. And I would also like to see that the question on whether a woman can lead the UN was answered resoundingly and affirmatively.
Thanks very much for your time. Thank you, Ms. Birkett.
You're most welcome.